There's an interesting book that was written several years ago named Isaac Storm. And the premise of the book is really, really interesting that this book was written to kind of give you a glimpse into history, but also a glimpse into the mindset of the people that it was being written about. And this author writes about an event that happened in Galveston, Texas in 1900, September of 1900. And what had happened was that in September of 1900, there was a storm that started to blow into the horizon. It started to come into Galveston Bay. Now, most of you all don't really think of Texas as really a beach destiny kind of place. And it's really nice. The views of the oil derricks out in the water are beautiful. And the crusty brown beaches are fantastic. But it is a beach, and it's a beach community. And a lot of people in Texas go down there and spend their time in Galveston. There's a lot of fun things to do there. But in 1900, it was a thriving city. And the storm comes rolling in. And it starts to rain. And the people look out at it and they go, oh, another storm. And it starts to rain and rain. And the streets start to gather some water early that morning. But there's still no concern. The kids go out and they start playing in the water and sloshing around and playing around. The men of the community get together and they go down to the local diner to eat breakfast. They start talking about how the rain's really coming in there, but it's not that big of a deal. And the water keeps on rising. And the storm gets a little worse, but nobody's worried about it. Everybody goes to work. They didn't think it was possible that anything could come up that far from the beach and do any damage into the city of Galveston. What you have to realize is that the city downtown area and all is a good mile or two away from the shoreline. And they weren't worried about it because there was this guy by the name of Isaac Klein. And Isaac Klein was the meteorologist of the area, and he had assured them that there was no big storm that was coming that way. It was a storm, but it wasn't going to be a big one. There was only one problem. It was a hurricane. And that hurricane that day killed 6,000 people. 6,000 people went along with their day, not thinking that anything could ever really happen, and they lost their lives. The entire community was wiped off the map. Devastation like had never been seen before. And as we look at our scriptures that we've been reading, that we're supposed to be reading today, we run across a period in time when Paul is on yet another voyage. And we'll be in Acts 27 this morning, and it's going to show us some events that go along with Paul and what happens. And I wanted to talk today about this idea of surviving the storms in our lives and what that even means. And looking at the word today and how Paul goes through this, how it so quickly can resemble us and where we need to be with things. Let's start with our reading. Acts 27, 9 through 12. Much time had been lost, and the sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and to bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Because the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix in the winter. This was harbor in Crete, facing both the southwest and northwest. And we have a situation here to where Paul can see what's going on. He can see the future, the handwriting's right there, and if anybody knows shipwreck, it's probably Paul. He sees the time of year, he sees what's getting ready to happen, he says, men, I can see that this is not going to work. And instead, the centurion, instead of listening to Paul, even though Paul is telling him, hey, I've got godly insight here, he listens to those who own the ship, who pilot the ship, those who should know what's the right thing to do. And what we have to realize in our first point this morning as we look at this, that failure to listen to godly warnings lead to stormy seas. Too many times in our lives, God is giving us warning signs. He's exposing us and he's telling us, you are going down the wrong path. If you continue on this way, you are going to have problems. There are storms in the horizon. I can see the future that's happening there. And as a matter of fact, there are sometimes that God even sends people in our lives that will tell us that we're going to have hard seas ahead of time. We don't have to cross this path, that we don't have to go there, that we don't have to expose ourselves to this potential sin, this potential hardship, that there are other routes to take. But all too often, we find ourselves looking at the experts, the ones who we feel like know better, the ones in the world that have it all together and say, no, you can have your cake and eat it too. No, you don't have to really go by all that. That's just really a suggestion that God gives. It's not really something He really expects out of you. He wants you to just be happy. It's all about what makes us feel good. It's all about the moment. It's all about the desire. And so often, God is giving us these warning signs saying, stop, don't go any further. You've not made the mistake yet, but if you continue on, you're going to. And it's going to be painful. And there's going to be loss. And you don't have to go through that. And too often, our failure to listen to God in the beginning causes our pain in the end. And all too often, we put ourselves in these stormy seas when we don't have to. Trying to cut corners. Trying to get there quicker. Trying to put ourselves in a different scenario than what we really know in our heart of hearts that we're in. How many times have we fallen into sin when in our heart of hearts we know that it's not going to end well? But our desires are so strong that we think somehow we convince ourselves that it'll be different this time. I'll have better control this time. It's not going to end up that way for me. I see how it did for him and for her, but I'm different. We ignore the moments when we're being told to change course. We read a little bit further on. So the men hoisted it abroad. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together because they were afraid they would run aground in the sandbars of Citrus. They lowered the sea anchor and they let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither the sun nor the stars appeared for many days, the storm continued raging. We finally gave up all hope of being saved. And in the midst of everything that happened, it starts to come in fruition. All the things that Paul warned them about are starting to happen. These 200 plus men that are on this boat are starting to realize that we've got a real problem here. But did you catch what we read the first part? They knew it wasn't going to be easy. Oh, life's not easy. Oh, I know it's not easy, but I can handle it. I'll just throw the rope underneath. I'll just tie it tight and we'll be just fine. And Paul was saying, God says to us, it's not going to be fine. You cannot go down this path without pain and suffering. It's not going to be okay. But we try to ride it out, and they tried to ride it out. And before it was over with, they're throwing stuff overboard. They're throwing the basics overboard, the extras. I'll just get a little leaner. I'll make it happen. Then they got more desperate. They're throwing their tackle overboard to the point where they finally gave up all hope of being saved. And it goes to my second point. Going through the storm without God leads to hopelessness. We need to understand that if we try to go through a storm of life without God, it leaves us feeling hopeless. It leaves us feeling like, what is the point? We can't get through this. It's not going to get any better. My life has no meaning. My life is horrible. How many times have we seen people that are going and struggling through life that feel like they just can't make it? That it just doesn't get any worse. And they literally give up. How many times have we watched people just give up? Without God, that's how you feel. But with God, we have this incredible ability to look at a storm and know that we're going to get through this. And Paul knew that they were going to get through this. When no one else knew, Paul knew. What was the difference factor? Paul knew what God had promised. Paul had a relationship with God and knew that God would not let him down. Did God deceive him that he wasn't going to go through a hard time? Not at all. And sometimes in our lives, this is something we need to realize that as Christians, sometimes we don't always control the scenario. Paul did not have control on if he wanted to get on the ship or not. He was on the ship. He gave the best advice that he could give. He did all the things right that he could do, but he still had to ride the ship with others. He was still in the storm. The difference is that when everybody else was wailing and gnashing teeth and throwing things overboard and fretting and getting sick and worrying, Paul was calm. Paul understood that he was going to get past it. Paul wasn't thinking, is this the last day I'm going to breathe? Is this the last day that I'm going to still be floating above? Is this the last time I'm ever going to see my family? Is this the last time? Paul wasn't worried about that because he knew that God had a bigger plan for him, that storm would pass. Even whenever it had been days of blackout and continual rain, Paul still knew that it was going to pass. Even whenever the ship was rocking back and forth, he still knew that it was going to be okay. Several years ago, I guess it was about 17 years ago or so, maybe a few more, I went on my first cruise. Pretty cool. I have to say, it's pretty awesome. Went on a Carnival cruise out of Galveston. And of course, I, being the frugal person that I am, I wanted to make sure that I got the best deal possible on when to go. And not really understanding seas and stuff like that, I found a really reasonable time to go, and I booked for me to go, and I took my oldest daughter with me. And we got on the ship, and we were really excited, and we had a great room, and we had a window, and it was fantastic. And we set off to sea, and we were going down to Cozumel, Mexico. And about 2 or 3, 4 hours in or so, it got dark. It was nighttime, and we were getting ready to go eat. And we had noticed something that was kind of going on in this ship that was, I don't know, 17, 20 stories high or whatever it was. I mean, the thing's massive. We noticed that it was doing something really kind of fun. It was kind of moving to the left and then moving to the right. And I was thinking, well, it's a boat. That's what boats do. Evidently, cruise ships aren't supposed to do that. And we were having a great time because nobody else was out anywhere on the cruise ship. I mean, it was like abandoned. And so we decided we'd play tag and run down the halls and do stuff. And it was a lot of fun because when you would run, and then you'd run, and then you'd run, and you'd run. Because it'd move back and forth, you'd hit the wall and you run back and forth. And we just laughed, had a great time, and went up and and got the pizza from the bar and stuff like that. And we just had a great time. And when we were coming back to our room a couple hours later, we started smelling this aroma that we did not care for very much. This smell of sickness. Because the majority of the boat was just plain sick. Because the boat was literally hitting 15 and 20 degrees back and forth. And I mean, everybody was out of it. And we went to bed that night, and I just slept like a baby. It was great, and got up the next morning, and you see all these green people walking around everywhere. And I realized then there must have been a problem. And so I asked them, they're like, oh, we hit some really, really stormy seas. I didn't know. I wasn't worried about it. I was having a great time. I had no concerns at all that anything bad was going to happen. And I think when I read this about Paul, he's going through the storm. He's kind of like, I'm not fretting over it. I wonder, as I look back, how many thousands of people that are in that boat were going, I need a refund. I don't want to be on here. Get me off this boat. I hate cruises. I'm never going on one again. I was thinking if we could do that every year, that'd be awesome. Because I wasn't worried about it. When we have God in our lives, we can go through these storms. And yes, there's still storms, and they're legitimate, but I don't have to worry that I'm not going to come out of it. It's only those who don't have a relationship with God that worry. And we go on a little bit further. After they'd gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves the damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, not only and not to be destroyed. Last night an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God. It will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. And we have a situation here where Paul stands up and goes, I told you. I told you. And we could end it right there, couldn't we? We as Christians sometimes, have we not been at that point? Well, what did you think was going to happen if you went there? Everybody knows that's what happens if you do that. I don't know how the sister didn't know she was going to have that affair. I didn't know how he didn't realize that he was going to get addicted to that. What did he think was going to happen if he was going to continue to do this? And we need to realize that people in storms, they need encouragement, not our spiritual arrogance. When our brothers and sisters are going through a storm, the last thing that they need from us is to go, well, don't you remember I told you that this was going to happen? Well, that's why I go to church all the time. Well, if you would have only been a part of life group, that probably wouldn't have happened. Well, if you would have only been reading your scriptures, well, that's why we come to church every Sunday morning. Oh, we could have easily left at the beginning like Paul did at the beginning and say, brothers, I told you. Told you. But he doesn't stop there, does he? He says, but take heart, have courage. God has still got you. God has still got you. And you're going to get through this storm. And you're going to make it. And it's going to be okay. Because God has a plan for you. God's plan is bigger than your storm. And as a church, we need to be the beacon in the midst of the storms that cry out to those who are suffering that there is something more. That you don't have to live in hopelessness. That take courage that, yes, you made a bad choice. And we're not going to candy coat that you did. But where you chose at the beginning is not where you have to end up. There is hope. God has a plan for you, and there is a future for you. And they need our encouragement and not our arrogance. For us, as we go through this, we need to know three things about navigating through storms. The first is this: we will all go through storms. There's not a one of us in here that will not go through a storm, that have not gone through a storm, and that will not go through future storms. It's a part of life. It happens. It doesn't make us bad Christians. It doesn't make us less. It doesn't mean God doesn't love us as much. It just means that we will go through storms. Either storms that we put on ourselves like the centurion did, or storms like Paul that we are in the middle of the wash and we cannot help it. It's just part of life. But we're going to go through storms. In 2 Corinthians 11, it says, 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked, and I spent the night and the day in the open sea. And Paul lays it out for us. I have been through it all. He says, I know what it is to walk through a storm. Jesus says it this way: I've told you these things so that you may have peace in this. In this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. He didn't say you might have trouble. Jesus says you're going to have trouble. If you follow me, if you are a follower of mine, if you obey the gospel, if you do as I ask, there will be trouble. But don't worry, I'm bigger than any trouble. There's no storm that compares to me. I've got it under control. Second thing we need to realize is that storms expose our faith. It's one of the biggest blessings of a storm. It really shows you where you're at in your faith. That could be a good thing. It could be a scary thing. But it is a growth thing. Romans 12:11-12 says, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer. Storms are going to expose our faithfulness. Storms are going to expose where we are spiritually. And without those storms, we can have a false sense of confidence. Without those storms, we forget who we really need to rely on sometimes. Without those storms, we don't grow. Unfortunately, that's just the way that it is. It's going to happen. And when it does, it's our opportunity to lean on God even more, to stretch our faith, to be able to grow closer to Him as He grows closer to us, protecting us more and more. Romans 15:3, Paul says, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in Him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. He says, may He fill you up in all circumstances with this hope that gives you peace. It's one thing that God offers in the midst of the storm, that there's peace. How is it possible that Jesus, in the midst of a storm, is sleeping on a boat when everyone else is afraid that they're going to die? How could He sleep like a baby? Because Jesus had a bigger picture in mind. So many times when we're in the midst of a storm, all that we can see is the rain and the waves and the crashing going on, and we cannot see that there's something on the other side. There's something on the other side. It will pass. And there are repercussions sometimes because of the storm. If we look at it, we have to realize that as we read on this, that Paul says at the end of the chapter, we will be saved. Not a one of you will pass, but we will run the ship into the ground. And we are going to have to hit an island. We still have some rough stuff to go, but we're getting through this. God promised us that we will get through this. Finally, storms reposition us. So many times in our Christian walk, we kind of get into a groove. I was watching a little bit of the Olympics, and they were doing these long distance skiing, and I had noticed that they had cut these thick grooves for these skiers to go through, and they all stayed in the groove the whole time. And the groove was probably at least 2 inches deep or more, and they could really move quickly through this area as long as they stayed in the groove. And sometimes the problem with that is that you no longer control where you're going. You just kind of get in there and you put it on cruise control. You just kind of go. And when we get in cruise control, it can be dangerous. I'll never forget, I was driving up to go to work at a church in Kansas, and I had bought an old car that was nothing short of a boat. 78 Chevy Impala, 4-door. This bad boy was about 2 lanes wide, about 4 cars deep. I mean, it was a beast. Horrible gas miles, but you know what the thing had? It was a luxury one back in the day. Now, you got to realize it was 20, 30 years old when I bought it. But it had one of the first cruise controls put into a car. Now, it wasn't one of the fancy ones. It had the little knob off the end. You push a little button in. Some of y'all remember the older cars that did that, right? And this car was so big, and I was driving up from Oklahoma Christian to go work at the church, and I was working for this church while I was going to school, and it was about a 3.5-hour drive, and I'd go up on the weekends and work with the kids and stuff. And if you're driving in Kansas, once you get past Wichita and you're driving north, it's just flat. And it's just straight. It's the flattest, straightest thing ever. And there's nothing to look at. I mean, nothing. And we were driving, I was like, cruise control, this is the best. Turned up the radio, hit it on cruise control, and I went, this is awesome. I don't even have to keep my feet down here. And I thought, you know what, I'm kind of tired, but I can kind of chill out. I'll make this like a recliner. I turned my hips sideways. I had my feet up in the passenger seat area. Still driving like this. I was like, this is cool. I mean, there's nobody else on the road. I'm having a great time. Literally fall asleep, cruise control going 80 miles an hour, straight lane, holding the wheel. I don't even know how long I drove. But I woke up and realized I could be dead right now. Because I just kept it in the groove. And I would have drove myself right to death. Sometimes in our faith, we need storms to reposition ourselves back to God. Sometimes we get so acclimated with what we're doing, we get in such a groove, it's such a pattern, it's so normal to every way that we always do things, nothing ever changes, that we find ourselves going, yeah, God, I'm with you all the way, and let me go ahead and hit it on cruise control, and I'll just cruise through my Christian life here. And I fall asleep, and I've set myself up to fail. And sometimes we need a little storm in our life to shake us up a little bit, make us readjust, focus on what we're supposed to be doing, and go the path that God calls for us to go. That's what storms do for us. As much as we don't like them, they are needed. God understood it, and He understood that we're not going to like it. And that's okay. But we need to realize, church, that it's okay to go into storms. And even if today you went into a storm voluntarily, you've done it to yourself. It's all your fault, and you know it. You don't have to feel hopeless. Today is the day that you can take and turn it around. Today's the day, instead of trying to button up the hatches and trying to throw other things off board and everything else, that we just stop and say, God, I trust you that you're going to get me through this storm. God, I acknowledge that I cannot do this on my own. We read the rest of the scriptures. Paul tells him, stop what you're doing. Eat. You've not eaten in days. Replenish yourself and get ready. Because we've got a little bit further to go, but we're almost done. And maybe this morning the Lord is telling you, come home. Replenish yourself. The church is here for you to replenish yourself. And let's finish this storm together. Because there's a sandy beach and warm air and brighter days waiting for you if you'll just trust in me. Is this morning the morning that you need to trust in him? Is today the day that you finally cut anchor and just let it be and let God take over? If it is, can you let us help you this morning in prayer? You allow us to be there with you this morning as you surrender to God and let him take over. And let us go with you in this storm so that we all get through it together. Because you're not alone. You don't have to be alone. We're all going to make it together. We can help you this morning. Will you allow us to do that as we stand and as we sing?